Listen to this before you make the same mistake I did. That was the first thought screaming in my head the day I realized the HOA wasn't just a neighborhood committee. It was a predator, circling, waiting for me to slip. I thought buying a ranch on the edge of a quiet community would be freedom, acres of land, peace of mind, and space where I could finally breathe without someone peeking through my blinds. But freedom, I learned, is something that threatens control freaks, and the HOA saw me as a threat the moment I moved in. Maybe it was because I was the only black rancher in the area. Maybe it was because I didn't bow to their ridiculous rules about grass height and mailbox colors. Either way, they were watching. At first it was letters, thin envelopes stuffed with fines, warnings, reminders about rules I had never agreed to. I tossed them in the trash, thinking they'd eventually get tired. But power-drunk tyrants don't get tired, they escalate. And one morning, I stepped outside and froze. There was a brand new fence, tall and cold, wrapped tight around my ranch like prison bars. My own land, boxed in, locked up, stolen, without a word of notice. I felt rage crawl up my spine, but beneath it something colder. The HOA thought they had me trapped. They thought they'd caged me. They didn't realize they'd just handed me the one weapon that could undo them completely. Because what they didn't know was that I had a plan, and it all started with a single gate key. Before I tell you how this whole HOA nightmare flipped upside down, do me one favor, drop a country flag in the comments so I know where you're watching from, because I guarantee HOA horror stories like this don't just happen in my corner of the world. Now let me paint you the real picture of how this all began. When I first bought the ranch, it wasn't just land. It was a dream I'd worked years to build. I grew up in a small house where neighbors complained if you so much as parked a truck on the street too long. So owning wide-open acres where I could raise horses, keep cattle, and breathe free air felt like victory. But the catch was this. Part of the property technically fell inside the influence of an HOA that oversaw the nearby suburban development. I laughed it off at first. What could they possibly say about my ranch? I wasn't planting roses in front of a townhouse. I was managing livestock. Turns out they had plenty to say. From day one, I noticed the stares. Driving board members slowing down by my driveway, whispering to each other. During community meetings, acting like my very existence was an eyesore. They fined me for excessive dust when I moved hay, for unauthorized fencing when I repaired a broken corral, even for visual inconsistency because my barn didn't match the pastel theme of their houses. I brushed it off because I thought, surely logic will win. Surely they'll realize a ranch isn't a suburb. But HOAs don't run on logic. They run on ego and intimidation. And I was the perfect target, different, independent, unbothered by their petty rules. And that's when they started planning their move, the one that would turn my life into a war zone, building that fence. One morning I walked outside and froze. The HOA had actually done it. Overnight, like a thief in the dark, they had erected a tall, ugly fence that sliced across my property like a scar. Not just some flimsy wire barrier, but heavy posts and steel mesh, locked up tight with a single gate. And guess who held the only key? Not me, them. I stood there, jaw clenched, staring at this ridiculous wall cutting me off from my own land, my cattle mooing on the other side, pacing like they knew something wasn't right. It wasn't just a fence, it was a message. You don't own this, we control you. And to make it worse, they had the nerve to slap a bright HOA emblem on the gate like it was some kind of trophy. Neighbors started gathering, whispering, shaking their heads, some smirking like they'd been waiting for this showdown. I stormed over to the HOA president, Karen in a suit with her clipboard and smug grin, and demanded answers. She didn't flinch. She said it was for community safety, that my open ranch posed risks, and the board had full authority to manage access. I laughed, out loud, because I knew what this really was. Power play, plain and simple. She wanted me humiliated, fenced out of my own dream. But here's the thing about people who think they've trapped you. They always underestimate what you're capable of when you're cornered. My blood boiled, but my mind raced faster, and instead of yelling, I smiled. Because in that moment, I wasn't thinking about fences. I was thinking about flipping the board's own game upside down. And the plan forming in my head? It was going to make that smug grin disappear forever. Now here's where it gets wild. Because when the HOA thought they had Me caged like an animal. That's when I found their blind spot. See, what Karen and her little clipboard army didn't know was that the land where they planted that shiny new fence, the strip with the gate they were so proud of, wasn't actually owned by the HOA. It belonged to an old rancher, a quiet man who had leased it out years ago and barely paid attention to it anymore. To them, it was just unused space. But to me, it was the choke point, the only access anyone had through that fence. And here's where fate stepped in. The rancher was tired, done with HOA drama, and ready to sell. When I found out, I didn't argue. I didn't waste breath fighting with Karen. I went straight to the man with a check in my hand and a fire in my gut. Within weeks, papers were signed, keys were exchanged, and suddenly the only gate that the entire HOA depended on belonged to me. Imagine the look on Karen's face when she strutted up to that fence one morning, clipboard in hand, barking orders at a contractor, only to find me leaning on the post, twirling the shiny gate key around my finger. Her smirk cracked like glass. Neighbors gasped. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just smiled and said, "Access is for owners only." That's when it hit her, and everyone watching. The HOA hadn't trapped me. I had checkmated them. What they built to control me, I now owned outright. And believe me, nothing rattles a tyrant faster than realizing their fortress is standing on your ground. The second Karen realized I held the only key to that gate, it was like watching a queen get knocked off the chessboard. Pure chaos. She stormed up, red in the face, voice screeching high enough to scare the birds off the power lines. "You can't do this. This is our fence," she barked, jabbing her finger at the lock like her authority alone could melt the steel. But the truth hit her like a freight train. The papers were signed, the land was mine, and no HOA bylaw in the world could change that. Neighbors gathered, whispering, some smirking behind their hands because they'd lived under her rule of terror for years, and now they were watching her empire crumble in real time. She rattled the gate, yanked on the bars, demanded I hand over the key, but all I did was stand, calm, leaning on that post like it was my throne, letting her tantrum burn itself out. The HOA board members shuffled nervously, trying to back her up, but without that gate. Their rules meant nothing. It was like they'd built a castle with no drawbridge. And the harder Karen shouted, the more obvious it became that she wasn't a leader. She was a bully cornered in her own game. When I finally spoke, it was just one sentence, slow and steady. "You built the fence. You made the rules. Now live with them." The crowd erupted in laughter, and the look on her face? Priceless. That was the first crack in the HOA's armor. The moment everyone realized Karen wasn't invincible, she was just loud. And the louder she got, the more she exposed just how powerless she really was. When the laughter faded and Karen's face turned purple with rage, the HOA board realized they were on the verge of losing everything, so they scrambled to claw back control. One of the board members, a guy who usually sat silent behind Karen, suddenly found his voice and waved a stack of papers like it was some kind of weapon. "This isn't legal. We'll sue. We'll call the county. You can't just take control of community access," he shouted, but his voice cracked halfway through, betraying the fact that even he didn't believe what he was saying. They circled like vultures, each throwing out empty threats. "We'll fine you every day. We'll revoke your membership. We'll bring in lawyers." But none of it mattered, because all the power now hung from the small silver key dangling from my belt. The crowd of neighbors had grown bigger, and their energy shifted. Instead of nodding along with the HOA, they were smirking, whispering, enjoying the rare sight of the tyrants being stripped of their fangs. Some even clapped when I calmly asked, "Fine me for what? Accessing my own land?" Karen's jaw dropped, her board members sputtered, but the truth was a wildfire they couldn't put out. Every word they tried to hurl at me came back like a boomerang, exposing just how weak their grip really was. You could see the fear creep into their eyes as the realization sank in. This wasn't just about one man with a gate key. This was a shift in power. The neighborhood had witnessed the HOA bluff collapse, and the people, who once trembled at Karen's letters, were now standing taller. For the first time, the HOA wasn't the wolf in the story. They were the sheep, and the crowd knew it. Cornered animals always lash out, and Karen was no different. With her authority slipping through her fingers, she grabbed for the one weapon she thought could still scare everyone: the law. She yanked out her phone, dialed 911, and with the fakest trembling voice I'd ever heard told the dispatcher that I was blocking community access and threatening the HOA board. The neighbors gasped, not because they believed her, but because they couldn't believe how far she'd stooped just to cling to control. Within minutes, the sound of sirens cut through the tension, and Karen straightened her blazer like a queen awaiting her loyal guards. But when the police cars pulled up, their headlights washing over the crowd, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. Officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts, scanning the scene. Karen rushed forward like an actress on stage, pointing at me with wild, exaggerated gestures. "That's him. He's refusing entry. He's hostile. He's violating HOA bylaws," she screeched, her voice cracking under the weight of desperation. But here's the thing about lies. You need evidence to back them up. And standing right there was a line of neighbors, witnesses who'd had enough of her bullying. One by one they spoke up, telling the officers exactly what really happened, that the HOA had fenced off my ranch, that I bought the property fair and square, and that Karen was the only one causing a disturbance. Even the officers' faces shifted as they listened, suspicion turning from me to her. The more she talked, the guiltier she looked. Her empire wasn't just cracking, it was crumbling in front of flashing lights and a crowd that would never forget. The silence that fell after the neighbors spoke was heavier than any fence Karen had ever built. The officers turned, their eyes narrowing on her, not me. You could almost see the panic crawl across her face, as if the mask she had worn for years was peeling right off in public. She tried doubling down, stammering excuses about HOA regulations and community safety, but her words sounded hollow, bouncing off the walls of truth the witnesses had just laid down. One officer pulled out a notepad, another asked her for proof of ownership, and that's when the trap snapped shut. She had none, not a deed, not a contract, not even a legal document to wave in the air, just her brittle pride. I stood back, silent, letting the storm she created swallow her whole. Neighbors who once whispered behind closed doors now stood tall, their voices steady as they exposed years of intimidation and harassment. Every testimony was another nail in the coffin of her so-called authority. Karen's face flushed red, her hands trembling as she realized this wasn't her stage anymore. It was her trial. The officers exchanged a glance, the kind that says, "We've heard enough," and suddenly Karen, the woman, who thought she owned everyone, was the one being asked to step aside, to calm down, to answer questions. It wasn't me on the defensive anymore. It was her. And the look in her eyes said it all. For the first time in her reign of terror, Karen understood that the law she had twisted like a weapon was finally turning its sharp edge back toward her. If you've ever seen a cornered predator realize the hunt is over, you know the look Karen wore that day. Wild eyes, flushed cheeks, desperation clawing for air. The neighbors, the very people she once ruled with fear and HOA fines, were now standing shoulder to shoulder, not with her, but against her. Phones were out, recording every twitch of her lips, every stumble in her voice, every lie unraveling in real time. Imagine being the self-proclaimed queen of the block, only to find your crown yanked off in front of your entire kingdom. She tried to scream over the voices, accusing me again, calling the neighbors traitors, even accusing the police of bias. But the louder she shouted, the smaller she looked. The officers didn't raise their voices, they didn't have to. Calmly, one read out loud the inspector's notes and the evidence I had, filed weeks earlier. Harassment, false claims, abuse of authority. And there it was, her power reduced to nothing more than a stack of complaints with her name stamped all over them. The crowd murmured, some gasped, a few even laughed outright when she claimed I had stolen community resources. It was like watching a dictator fall, not in private shame but under the crushing weight of public truth. Every second stretched, every eye burned into her, until finally she broke, tears streaked. Through the cracks of rage on her face, her voice faltering into whimpers. But sympathy? None. The same neighbors she bullied for years now crossed their arms, shook their heads and turned away. That was her true punishment, worse than fines or citations. To be stripped of respect, to be left powerless in the very arena she built for herself. Karen wasn't just exposed, she was humiliated forever. The dust didn't settle quickly. It exploded. By the next morning, Karen's downfall wasn't just whispered between fences, It was broadcast across the entire community like wildfire. Screenshots of her frantic 911 call, clips of her screaming in front of the cops, and the inspector's calm takedown were circulating in group chats, neighborhood forums, even Facebook community pages. Her carefully curated image, the responsible HOA leader, the self-proclaimed guardian of the neighborhood, was gone, replaced by videos of her red-faced meltdown and transcripts of her lies. Neighbors who had once lived in silent fear now found their voices, some sharing their own horror stories, others openly mocking her in comment sections. And the HOA board? They weren't about to go down with her. Within days, they called an emergency meeting, and in less than an hour, Karen was stripped of her title, her authority, her seat at the table. She tried to spin it as a temporary leave, but no one bought it. Her credibility had been nuked. What made it even worse for her was the way the neighborhood shifted without her. Fences painted, gardens redone, kids riding bikes without her barking about rules. Freedom was in the air, and Karen had no part in it. But for her, the fallout went deeper than losing control. Businesses she worked with backed away. Her name became a warning label, and the very same neighbors she once lorded over now crossed the street to avoid her glare. Karen wasn't just out of power. She was a ghost, walking through a neighborhood that had finally realized life without her wasn't just better, it was peaceful. And for someone who thrived on control, being irrelevant was the sharpest punishment of all. Here's the thing about power. It's only as strong as the fear people have of it, and once Karen was exposed, that fear evaporated like morning fog under sunlight. The neighbors, who once whispered complaints and tiptoed around her demands, suddenly realized they weren't powerless pawns. They were a community, and together they were stronger than any one bully. The atmosphere shifted overnight. The man who had been too scared to park his truck in his own driveway now left it proudly out front. The family who'd hidden their lawn decorations finally set them up again, kids laughing as they placed them without glancing over their shoulders. Even the smallest changes, like doors left open, music playing on a Sunday afternoon, were symbols of rebellion that turned into acts of liberation. For the first time, people weren't just reacting to Karen, they were reclaiming their neighborhood. And the real turning point came during the next HOA gathering. Instead of an anxious room bracing for Karen's tirades, there was energy, clapping, smiling, a sense of unity. The inspector's report was read aloud, the truth laid bare, and one by one, neighbors stood up to share their stories. Each testimony was another nail in Karen's coffin, another reminder that her reign had been built on intimidation, not leadership. The HOA wasn't just free of her, it was alive again, and the neighborhood was buzzing with possibility. People started talking about community projects, about helping each other instead of policing each other, about turning the place into what it should have always been, home. And standing there, watching it all unfold, I realized this wasn't just the end of Karen. It was the rebirth of everything she had tried to strangle. The neighborhood had found its voice, and this time, no one was giving it up. At the end of it all, standing on my porch looking out over the neighborhood, I realized something that hit harder than anything Karen ever tried to throw at me. Bullies only win when good people stay silent. Karen thrived for years because fear kept everyone quiet, but the moment we stopped bowing our heads, her power crumbled like dust. And here's the real lesson. Sometimes, life doesn't hand you justice neatly wrapped. Sometimes you have to fight for it, even if it means enduring lies, intimidation, and nights where you question if it's worth it. But when you hold your ground, when you refuse to let someone strip away your dignity, the payoff is freedom, not just for you but for everyone around you. Watching my neighbors smile again, kids running around without parents worried about another letter taped to the door, was worth every second of the battle. Karen's fence, her threats, her so-called authority, they were never stronger than a community willing to stand together. She thought she could own us, but in the end, we owned the one thing she could never control, the key to our freedom. And here's what I want you to take from this. Don't let anyone build walls around your life, not an HOA, not a toxic boss, not even a so-called friend. Because the moment you give them that power, they'll take everything. But if you stand tall, if you fight smart, you don't just win, you inspire others to do the same. That's how you turn a neighborhood, a workplace, a family, into a place of strength, not fear. And trust me, once you've lived free of a Karen, you'll never let one rule you again. And that's the end of this wild ride, my friends. Karen thought she could fence me in, but in the end I walked away with the only key that mattered: freedom. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a Karen in your life? Someone who tried to control, belittle, or push you around? Drop your story in the comments because I read every single one. And hey, before you head out, smash that like button so more people can see how justice can be served. Subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that bell so you never miss the next story. Trust me, the next one will blow your mind. Until then, stay strong, stay sharp, and never let anyone fence you in.